The war in the Pacific, military history, and today is my favorite topic of today, called War in Hell, and that's New Guinea and the South Pacific. Okay, so what happened after the Battle of Midway, and particularly the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese army still wanted to take Port Moresby, which is down there. So they still wanted to capture Port Moresby in order to isolate the Coral Sea in Australia from the being able to be resupplied from the United States. Simple enough. So remember, we have their main base here at Rabaul. We talked about the fact that they'd already invaded part of New Guinea when they took Lae and Salamua. And now what they want to do, because they couldn't do the sea invasion of Port Moresby, which they tried, which they were defeated at the Battle of the Coral Sea, is they're going to try to come overland. They are going to land at Buna, and they are going to march over the Owen Stanley Mountains and capture Port Moresby. They also wish to take Milne Bay. The reason they take Milne Bay is, A, it gives them an air base that covers the Coral Sea much better than what they have presently at Rabaul and Lae. So that gives them more coverage and also gives them an opportunity to have a closer base to Port Moresby. Okay, so New Guinea, as I said, is war in hell, and when you think about Rogers and Hammerstein and you think about the place South Pacific, everything's like really pretty, and it's, you know, tropical islands, and there's coconuts, and there's, you know, lots of pretty native girls around. Well, unfortunately, the war in the South Pacific was anything but that. It was really, how did I describe it? A miserable, disease-infested jungle. That is what the South Pacific actually is. Neither side really wanted to fight there. The only reason they were going to fight there was because of air power. In other words, they needed those air bases. But there's nothing really there. There's no towns or cities, really. There's just little tiny native settlements. And the people that live in these islands are basically hunter-gatherers. And they have a taste for a thing called long pig. And those of you that are unaware of what long pig might be, that would be human flesh. And so the interesting thing about that is that many Japanese that were cut off from their supplies later in the war did in fact end up on the dinner table of some of these indigenous population. The other thing, when we think about World War II, and let's talk about Europe. When the Germans take Czechoslovakia, they get the largest, or excuse me, one of the largest armaments factories in the world. It's called the Skoda Works. When they take that Skoda Works, they immediately have this thing cranking out tanks and guns for the German army. When they took France in 1940, they received the French auto factories. So the French auto factories indeed provided many trucks for the German army that they would later use in the war, particularly to invade Russia. Well, when the Japanese expand, all they are getting is natural resources. There are no production facilities in any of these areas. So all they're getting is natural resources, which then have to be transported to Japan and turned into war material. So what is in effect happening to the Japanese is the more they continue to expand their perimeter, they are actually getting weaker and weaker because they have more places to defend that aren't really contributing to their war economy in any direct manner. Well, the terrain in this area is also pretty incredible. It is realistically a triple canopy rainforest. Those of you familiar with that term. It rains a lot, like 200 inches per year. So everything is wet and muddy, which also causes a problem called trench foot. It's impossible to keep your feet dry. So what happens is, or we call it, I believe now is foot immersion, I think is the proper term today. But they at the time called it trench foot. And what would happen is your feet would literally deteriorate from being wet all the time and could lead up to amputation. So really not a happy place. It's really mountainous in the South Pacific. So on the Solomon Islands, for example, there are peaks that go to 14,000 feet. And then below that, you have this stuff called kunai grass. You have the triple canopy rainforest, and then closer to the coast, you have this kunai grass, which is like 6 feet high and razor sharp. And then another thing is when you actually get to the coast, you have little strips of beach, but then they usually lead into tidal basins or mangrove swamps. So it's just really not a happy place. And if you look at this thing here, this is a thing called the Kokoda Trail or the Kokoda Track. Depending on if you're Australian, you call it a track. And this was created by the local indigenous population. I will call them natives just for ease. And the fact of the matter is what that is that's logs that are set at 18-inch intervals so they could literally walk up the mountains. Because again, this is an incredibly mountainous area. There are no large predators in the rainforest. There are birds, land crabs, rats, snakes, and insects. The canopy is up to 200 feet high because the trees are extremely tall, trying to get sunlight. And the swamps and the tidal basins also do have some creatures. They have freshwater and saltwater crocodiles, so occasionally an unwary bather will become lunch for them as well. And it's equatorial, so it's incredibly hot. Its temperatures can be well over 100 degrees. Of course, it rains 200 inches, so it's humid as hell. And consequently, it's just a miserable place in that regard. And even on top of the mountains, it's very hot, but at night it gets really cold. Well, what do you get when you put all this together? You get mosquitoes because it's wet and it's hot. So consequently, the mosquitoes carry dengue fever, and most importantly, they contain malaria. So this is one of the most malarial places in the world, and troops that fight here have a tendency to get malaria at about approximately an 80% rate. Now, there's no real cure for malaria at the time. The only thing they can do for it is to give you a suppressant, which is quinine, or more effective, a German invention called atabrine. It also has scrub typhus, which kills, and that's carried by chiggers, which are incredibly endemic to the region. So, you put all this together. You're a soldier in this area. You're not eating properly because you're fighting. You're not sleeping properly. It's incredibly hot. It's constantly raining, and it's covered with disease. And what that shows you is that this land actually kills. So if you can isolate your enemy from being able to get supplies, you don't need to go actually physically attack them. All you have to do is prevent them from being resupplied, and they will either A, starve to death or die of disease. And this is later on in the war what actually the Allies do to the Japanese. So let's look at the numbers. U.S. Army medical records for this area in 42 show that 128,000 soldiers were treated for disease, 6,438 for psychiatric reasons, and 2,887 were treated for wounds. Now, I tend to think the wound number is very low because things that you and I would immediately go to the hospital for back then, because of the tough terrain and it's hard to evacuate wounded, is what most likely would happen is you'd put a bandage on it and keep going, okay, and do the best you could. So I think the wound number is very, very low compared to what it probably really was, but still, it's nowhere near the 128,000 for disease. If you look at this picture, you can see a wounded soldier being carried up the Kokoda Trail. So the only way to get anything on the Kokoda Trail or Kokoda Track was to carry it in by porters, by hand. There were no roads. There's still no road today. between Port Moresby and Boona to go over the mountains. There's no roads whatsoever. So consequently, everything that goes in between these two areas has to be carried by hand. All right, so look at this picture of the Australian troops with artillery. So they're dragging, literally dragging, that's a British 25-pounder artillery piece. In other words, it fires a 25-pound shell. They're literally dragging this thing through the rainforest. And so none of these armies, Japanese, British, Australians, the US, are really prepared to fight in this place. But all the armies would do their best to adapt to it so they could achieve victory. Now, we've talked numerous times about the Japanese army. It's a relatively poor army. It's a relatively poor country. They don't have mass artilleries. They don't have a lot of trucks and tanks. And that's really kind of shown by the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939 versus the Russians. So basically, the Russians kicked their butt because they had more tanks and more trucks. So the Japanese developed what we also talked about was these light infantry tactics. They would basically sneak around little forces carrying what they needed, and also they would do most of their attacks at night. So basically the Japanese could deal with this terrain relatively well because their army was built kind of to handle this kind of a situation where there would be a lack of infrastructure. But the other problem they have is they never really put a lot of focus on logistics. And so since this land kills, if you don't keep your men fed and have proper medical treatment for them, they are going to die anyway. The Australian U.S. forces are structured to fight the Battle of Europe, where there will be roads and railroads and cities and towns and all these trappings of civilization. Of course, none of that exists here, but both of these armies are actually quite highly adaptable. Again, they don't have any roads, but the whole fighting here becomes something vastly different. Now, just to point out something, I showed you that picture of the Australian troops dragging that giant 25-pounder through the jungle. This is a captured Japanese 70-millimeter gun. Now, it kind of looks like a toy cannon, and realistically, compared to a 25-pounder, it is a toy cannon. But the fact of the matter is, it's a heck of a lot easier to drag that thing through the jungle than it is that 25-pounder. So the Japanese, as I said, were pretty much, just because of their design of their army, was actually initially in a better position to handle this terrain. Now, when you're in this terrain, you can't see anything. So the jungle is like really close to you. And you're in that kunai grass, you literally can't see 2 feet in front of you. So what would happen is these fights would break out because people would stumble into each other, or you couldn't see that there was a defensive position there until you were like right on top of it. And then there would be these incredible firefights at point-blank range. And you couldn't surround an enemy particularly easily, because what they would do is they would melt back into the jungle. So if a unit was about to be destroyed, it was still relatively easier on both sides for the unit to run off into the bush and get away, because literally you can't see anything. And to use the quote here, they would melt away into the green fog. And the book Touch with Fire by Bergerud, which was on my list of recommended readings, I'll use this quote. Although the struggle in the South Pacific contained elements of modern warfare, its essence more closely resembled a knife fight out of the Stone Age. So basically, you couldn't use a lot of modern equipment in these types of fights. Now, this is a banyan tree, and what would the Japanese and the US would do, and the Australians, is they would dig in underneath this root system and then use this as a little fort. So it was very common, and the same thing happened, I believe, in Vietnam as well, where you would dig up underneath that root system and you'd get in there and then you could shoot out between the gaps in the roots. So it was kind of an interesting thing, but that was common in the jungle to see these types of trees. So the Japanese rely on, like I said, night infiltration, and the U.S. and Australian troops at night would literally not leave their foxhole. So if you were in your foxhole at night, you did not get out of your foxhole to go to the bathroom or do anything. You would stay in that foxhole, because if you got out of that foxhole, it was very likely that you would be killed by one of your own men. The last thing you'd want to do, though, is, of course, to fire your rifle, because when you would fire your rifle, you would become visible to the enemy, and they knew where they would possibly throw a grenade. So basically, you would stay in your hole at night. The Japanese would creep around, and occasionally, when you thought you saw or heard a Japanese, you would pitch a grenade outside your hole, and hopefully that would, deter them from further coming by you. And the Allies only attack during the daytime at this time of the war. So basically the night belongs to the Japanese, the day belongs to the Allies. Because of the jungle, because of this triple canopy, you cannot use air power. So air power becomes not effective against the ground troops, because quite honestly, you would have too much chance of being hit by a bomb, because the bomb plane doesn't know what it's really dropping. It's dropping on a bunch of trees, so they can't really see where they want to attack. So consequently, what they do use air power to do is to interdict supply. So if they can stop you from receiving supplies, if they can stop you from getting, medical goods and food, the land will just kill you on its own. And that's why the aircraft still are very, very effective in this fight. Because the less supplies your opponent has, obviously, the sooner you will win the battle. Artillery is the same thing. Like I showed you with that giant 25-pounder, it's impossible really to move that big piece of artillery and large amounts of artillery. And, of course, you need to get shells to all those guns, too. And everything has to come in carried on the back of a man. So consequently, there's no trucks or infrastructure to move large amounts of artillery shells. So logistics plays a very interesting role in these battles. All right, so let's talk about the weapons that are actually going to be used here. So you're not going to be using much aircraft. You're not going to be using a lot of artillery. What you're going to be using is simple infantry weapons. And let's look at the different types of rifles that each group is carrying. The U.S. Army is outfitted with the M1 Garand rifle. It is the first semi-automatic gun that is issued to any military. It is our standard weapon. And because it's semi-automatic, I will demonstrate the principle of that. It's a gas-operated weapon. It has 8 bullets in a clip. And you put the clip in, you got 8 shots. Now this gun will fire as fast as you pull the trigger. Bang, 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 8 shots. Then you could put another 8 shots in. So this gun fires really fast. And if you're in a jungle at point blank range and somebody's coming at you, bang, 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 okay? Now, that is a big, big advantage. It's not particularly heavy, it's not particularly light, but it's not ridiculous, and it's not particularly long. It has a 500-yard range. But again, you're not going to need a 500-yard range in the jungle. Well, what do the Japanese have? They have a bolt-action rifle that carries 5 rounds. And so if a bolt-action rifle, if I'm going to shoot at you, bang, 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 that's as fast as I can shoot. And I can only shoot 5 times, and then I have to reload it. So it's a much slower weapon to use, particularly in the jungle. So I can't put out much firepower with this thing. It's also extremely long because it uses a 6.5 millimeter bullet, which is much smaller than ours. Ours are about 7.7 millimeter. And consequently, it needed a longer barrel to get a good muzzle velocity and get that bullet really moving quickly because of its small mass. So let's look at a Japanese soldier. If I'm a Japanese soldier, I'm not particularly tall. I'm not particularly tall in general, but the fact of the matter. Now, I've got this thing, it's 40 inches high, right? It's actually 50 inches high, it's 4 feet high, over 4 feet high. And I put a bayonet on it. The gun is probably taller than I am with a bayonet. So it's a very long weapon. So it's cumbersome in the jungle. Okay, I can't sweep it around easily. But it has a couple of advantages. It's incredibly reliable. That's one good thing. And the Japanese have come up with a powder, a propellant for its shells, that is really far in advance of what we use and what the British use. The powder that they use to fire that 6.5 millimeter bullet is virtually smokeless, and it doesn't have a lot of muzzle flash. So when you shoot it at night, you don't see a lot of bright flash coming out of that barrel. It's very advanced. And again, it's an extremely strong and reliable weapon. Now, the M1 Garand, the U.S. soldiers would refer to it as Old Smoky because when you fired it, there was so much smoke coming out of the barrel. So consequently, you could see the smoke and know where your enemy was. So the Garand did have some issues, primarily with U.S. powders. Yes? I'm sorry? Oh, that's here, let's go back. All right, it's an internal magazine. So they would pop in a zip clip, they'd call it. They'd pop a zip clip into that internal magazine. So there is no magazine showing on this gun. It doesn't have a box magazine like you'd be more common today. So basically you loaded it, and then it had 5 shots. Okay? Then there's the British Lee Enfield #1 Mark III. This is the standard Australian gun. This is commonly known as a short magazine Enfield. This is really a very good gun. It still has the limitations of being bolt action, but it does fire 10 rounds. It's also got long range, which isn't particularly a big issue in the jungle. It's about the average weight, 8.5 pounds. But it's really a really good gun. There would be arguments, I'm sure, if I was talking to a bunch of gun guys, there would be an argument, well, I think the Mauser was better. Okay, well, all right. But realistically, the fact that it fired 10 shots, you could get a lot of rounds off, and it was a very smooth action gun. It was used in World War I and World War II. In fact, the Australian Army, I think, used it in past Korea. I think they used it into the mid-50s or early 60s. So it had a very long life. Well, we also had this available. And the Thompson submachine gun, or commonly known as the Tommy gun, or a Tommy, this gun fires a very heavy 45 caliber bullet. So when you get hit with a bullet, even though the muzzle velocity is very low, it's a pistol round. It's the same round used in the standard World War II U.S. Army pistol, the Colt 45 version. So anyway, it's a pistol round. It's really heavy. It's designed to hit. When it hits something, it knocks it down. Okay? You get shot with one of these, you know you've been shot. And the fact of the matter is, it can fire 600 rounds a minute. Now, if I'm in a jungle and somebody's coming at me, I'll tell you what, if I had to pick one of these weapons, that's the one I'd pick. Okay? Because now I can just spray bullets in a general direction, and hopefully I hit something. But I'm surely going to be scaring the hell out of whoever's coming after me. So that is a tremendously popular weapon, particularly with the Australians, not so much with the U.S. Marines. Part of the reason it was a problem is it's heavy. It weighs a lot. It weighs 13 pounds loaded. It's difficult to keep it clean and operating properly. And you'll notice in this early version of the gun, it has this big round magazine. They came in 2 sizes, 50 bullets and 100. And they had to be clock wound into there, spring loaded. So it was difficult in the bush to keep that thing functioning properly, and also it was difficult to, if you ran out of a drum and you didn't have another drum with you, it was difficult to reload that drum in any sort of quick fashion. That was later replaced by a single clip of 20 or 30 rounds, and that's a more common version that you'll see. But in this time of the war, the Australians particularly were using this drum magazine. The drum had one other problem too. It had a bad habit of sort of falling off at the wrong time. So you kind of had to treat that gun with a lot of respect to keep it clean and firing properly. But when it was kept properly firing, it was by far the best weapon in the jungle. And the Japanese have no equivalent weapon at all at this time. They do not have a submachine gun at all. Now we look at this picture. Here we've got a bunch of Australian guys. They're not wearing shirts. It's hot. So guess what? You're getting a lot of mosquito bites. You're getting chigger bites. They're up to their ankles in mud. Notice that two of them are carrying Lee Enfields, and this gentleman appears to be carrying a Tommy. This is very, very common for to have several riflemen, but always hopefully somebody's carrying a Tommy gun as well, and that was pretty typical for the Australian Army. Well, the Australian Army comes into two major groups. There is the militia, which is kind of like our National Guard, only they're drafted. So if you're drafted into the militia, you are committed to fighting in Australia or an Australian possession. That's all you're committed to. You're not committed to going overseas at all to fight for Britain. They're not particularly well trained. Hopefully they are getting officers from a different group called the AIF, which is the Australian Imperial Force, and those people are professional combat veterans, and that's who they would try to get officers from this. It's much like U.S. National Guard in that the officers frequently were, local town leaders, so necessarily they weren't professional military guys as much as they might have been a prominent politician or a lawyer in town. The most important Australian fighting force is the Australian Imperial Force. This is a completely volunteer group, and they have agreed that they will fight at the behest of the Australian government anywhere in the world to support the British Empire. These are professional soldiers. These are pros. They were sent to North Africa. 3 of the 4 divisions went to North Africa and fought the Germans very well. Particularly the first Battle of Tobruk. They made a famous stand there and held the town from Rommel. So they're very well trained, very motivated. And Prime Minister Curtin, the Prime Minister of Australia, when the Japanese threat becomes apparent, he demands that the British return his divisions, his AIF divisions. The British are not really happy about this. They really don't want to return these divisions, but they agree to return 2 of them immediately. They really have no choice, with the reasoning that they will keep 1 still in the African desert. Well, as you may remember from our second class, the Australian Imperial Force 8th Division is lost at Singapore and Rabaul. So they never had even gotten to the Western Desert. They were shipped there immediately, right after they had been trained. The 3rd, of course, was kept, and the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff tell the Australians, at the behest of Prime Minister Churchill, really, look, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll give you 3 U.S. divisions if you'll leave 1 of your divisions in North Africa, which they agree to, which is a very good deal, really. You get 3 for 1. So that's what happens. Now, I mentioned kunai grass. That's what kunai grass looks like. So needless to say, if you're fighting in these conditions, you really can't see too far in front of you. That's why that Tommy gun's kind of a nice thing to have. So the AIF, like I said, was highly trained, highly motivated. They're now fighting for their homes, because they're not fighting in the North African desert anymore. They are literally fighting to protect Australia from Japanese invasion. And they also know that the Japanese had been incredibly brutal to the prisoners of the 8th Division and to Australian and British subjects that were captured at Singapore. They're well aware of the bad treatment. So they're not exactly unwilling to fight. So when we rate these later in the war, this is kind of later in the war, it was said that the Australians were the best jungle fighters. It was said that the Japanese were the 2nd best jungle fighters. And it was said that the United States, nobody really knew if they could fight in the jungle, because the United States would just knock the jungle down before they would launch an attack. So that just kind of shows you the different capabilities of logistics. The United States could literally afford to use massive amounts of shelling and artillery when possible to literally annihilate the jungle. All right, so let's talk about the Japanese cult of death. And this is when the war starts getting incredibly ugly. It was an extremely brutal fight. The Japanese, as I'm sure many of you are aware, would absolutely refuse to surrender. And consequently, they treated their prisoners incredibly poorly, and they treated everyone relatively bad. So, to use Burger Root again, the fighting in the South Pacific became a war without mercy. A lot of modern scholars have tried to say this is primarily due to racial factors, okay, that, you know, there was racism. The Japanese didn't like white people. The white people didn't like Orientals or Asians. I think that's a factor, but I think there's a much bigger factor to this. And the bigger factor is that the Japanese were raised from childhood, particularly after 1890 when the imperial rescript came out about for mandatory education in Japan. Every day, the Japanese would in effect say a pledge of allegiance that swore fealty to the emperor and willingness to die for the country, every day. The military had a rescript as well, which had to be recited to the letter every single day, saying that indeed that their death was as light as a feather and duty was as heavy as a mountain. So from childhood, death in battle was portrayed as an honor to the family and transcendent act on the part of the individual. Surrender was a disgrace to the soldier and his family. It is against the Japanese military law to surrender. You may never, ever surrender according to Japanese law. You must die or win. You don't have a choice. Things become, again, more and more brutal. You see here a severed head on a tree. And the Japanese military had other issues that caused, I think, this problem. Their soldiers themselves were brutalized by their officers. Every day, Japanese soldiers were kicked, slapped, even beaten with clubs by their superiors. That was designed to make them completely obedient. But I also think that all this corporal punishment also led them to feel that they should inflict similar pain and suffering on people they captured. Because remember, anybody who surrendered to the Japanese was obviously inferior because they weren't allowed to surrender. So you must be a loser if you would surrender to them. So consequently, you didn't deserve any respect. The other piece, though, is that the Japanese, because of this type of behavior, would literally follow orders that meant certain death. That is not common in the U.S. or in any Western country. So if I told you, a Japanese soldier, I said, look, I want you to go in the middle of that road and dig a hole and sit there with a bomb, and when a U.S. tank goes over you, I want you to explode that bomb and blow up the tank, and of course yourself, they would do that. They would think that was, okay, I've been ordered to do that. That's what I'm going to do. So they would literally take orders like that. Now, honorable surrender has been developed over the years, over many, many years, really, is when your unit is surrounded and it serves no more military purpose. In other words, you know you're defeated. It's agreeable to surrender. This benefits both sides by the fact that it limits casualties. So basically, if I'm surrounded on an island or whatever, and I decide, okay, I give up, then it was acceptable to take those people prisoner. And that, again, it just limits the destruction of war. The Japanese wouldn't do that. They would continue to fight. They could not surrender by their law. And even wounded Japanese would not surrender. They would try to put a grenade by themselves, and if a U.S. soldier or a medic came up to them to try to give them aid, they would pull the pin on the grenade to try to blow themselves up and the enemy. Because remember, they have to die. So, Japanese military personnel would continue to fight even when physically incapacitated. So what do the Allied soldiers do? You see a wounded Japanese, you shoot him. It's just that simple. I'm not going to take the chance that this guy is going to not surrender and blow me up. So when I see wounded Japanese soldiers, I just shoot them. It becomes a war of annihilation. So Japanese units, when they're fighting to the death, there's two ways. They're going to do one of two things. They're going to either kill themselves with a grenade, or another option was to take that long Arisaka rifle, and you would put it in your, you'd lay down, you'd put it up to your head, and you would pull the trigger with your foot, with your toe. And you would shoot yourself because you couldn't reach it, it was too long. So consequently, they would shoot themselves in the head with their own rifle, or they would do another thing. Later in the war, particularly, it was known in the U.S. as a banzai charge. But in Japan, it was known as a gyokusei, or gyokusai. And a gyokusai, it translates to Japanese to shattered jewel. So the jewel being the fighting force, and the jewel is shattered to destruction. And I think the infantryman, Australian infantryman Bill Crooks says it best. We knew their Bushido Banzai code was to take no prisoners in battle and never surrender, so we killed them. Okay, let's take a real short break, and then I'm going to come back and try to wrap this and get us into the war. I know, I wanted to take a break. I'm trying to pick up the pace.
Okay. That's why I didn't say anything.
I know, that's all right. I called it myself.
And I'm just going to leave a little after 2
Okay.
to go to the doctor. So.
Okay.
Have you seen this?
Well, it looks like an airplane. No, I haven't. It's cute, though.
Isn't it neat? It's about a situation that happened in the Pacific. I thought you might want to see it.
I do.
I love the cover.
I do, too.
It's even rivets, you know, with the
Yeah.
hinge.
Yeah, I mean, they just don't make them like that anymore, you know? Are you cold?
I'm always cold.
It's always cold in here. I'm sorry?
This is so wonderful. I just feel like I'm right there.
Well, thank you. It's pretty. Oh yeah, it's horrible. It's miserable. It's a worse. You couldn't pick a worse place to fight a war. I mean, well, like I said, it's here. Wait, it's going to get worse. it's, like I said, it's going to get worse. I mean, think about that. You're in water all day long, okay? You're getting bit by mosquitoes that are covered with diseases. I mean, it's, like I said, you would go to a hospital. These guys didn't really have the option. They really didn't. A lot of times, if you had just a minor wound, you just stay there. You had nowhere to go. Where are you going to go? I'll show you. I'm going to show you an Australian field hospital. Okay? You tell me. Do you want to go? After you see it, do you want to go to the hospital?
This is about that H-bomb that fell off.
Oh yeah, off Spain.
This is an interesting article by the guy that was working there in Spain and helped design it and stuff. And the fisherman that
Pulled it up.
he saw it. He could catch fish well because he could look across the land and line up points
Yeah.
and get himself oriented without navigation equipment. And he knew
Pretty much exactly where one of them went in.
Yeah, he told him right where it was.
Yeah.
You know the whole story. If you want to read it.
I'll read it. Sure. I know a lot about it. Here, let's give it to Linda. Everything has to go to Linda.
Okay.
All right, I'm trying to beat Kicklighter for the shortest break ever. Come on, help me out. All righty. So now we're going to talk about the Battle of Milne Bay. And as you can see here, that's where Milne Bay is. It's on the very tip of New Guinea there, extreme eastern tip. And consequently, it has a wonderful ability to dominate the Coral Sea with air power. But actually, the U.S. and the Australians and MacArthur wanted to put a bomber base there. At the same time, the Japanese thought it was a great place, because everybody thought this was a great place to be. And consequently, the deal with putting a bomber base there is there's no mountain range. So if I put bombers here, they first have to fly over the mountains and use a bunch of fuel in order to get over the mountain range to attack Rabaul. If I put a bomber base here, they can just have a nice low flight, and it's much easier than trying to get over that giant mountain range with a full load of fuel. So there's a lot of advantages to this place, particularly, again, you can dominate the Coral Sea, and you can use it as particularly the Allies, as a bomber base. So in June of 42, the Australian militia, remember there's two types of Australian forces. There's the Australian militia, who can fight in New Guinea because it's an Australian possession, and there's the AIF being the better trained and equipped troops. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that a lot. And then we also have U.S. engineers and a coastal artillery unit that MacArthur sends along so they can begin construction of this base. They're going to build 3 airfields, and the first one, a fighter base, becomes operational on July 22nd, and Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, P-40 fighters are based there. Now these play a critical role in what's going to happen. The original Japanese plan is actually not to capture Milne Bay, but to capture an island that's dominates Milne Bay. It's right in front of it. But the Japanese see that there's an air base being built on this by the Allies, and they said, well, you know what, we're going to capture Milne Bay. And Milne Bay is interesting too. It's incredibly deep and consequently and really sharp. So you can take a ship, a big full-size ship, and in certain parts of that bay, you can put them within 50 feet of the shore, and they're still not touching bottom. So you can get offload supplies very easily at Milne Bay. So Milne Bay is actually a very, very strategic location. The Japanese, unfortunately for them, are under the misconception that Milne Bay is lightly defended. They think that, well, we'll land 2,000 SNLF, Special Naval Landing Force. Those are the Japanese equivalent to our Marine Corps. They are naval troops. That they can land 2,000 of them and two tanks, and they can capture Milne Bay. What they don't realize is that the Australians, because of Ultra, are well aware that they are going to make this attack, and what they do then is they put in 8,000 troops. So you got 2,000 Japanese with 2 tanks going after 8,000 Australians. And these are really, some of these are really good troops because they're from the 2nd AIF Division. Japanese plan to land their main force inside the bay, and an additional force overland that's actually north at Toapota, I believe is the proper pronunciation. Don't quote me on that. And they're going to march overland to attack Milne Bay defenders from the rear. We'll see that in this map. So if you look at the lower map here, they're going to land a group at here, and they're going to march south to take the Australians in the rear. The main landing is going to come here and land in the bay itself. Well, unfortunately for the Japanese, they've taken a place called Goodenough Island, and they've landed their barges, and they're getting prepared for the next day to make the final trip into that little town, to Apota. Well, unfortunately for them, the Australian Air Force P-40s see those barges and begin to attack them. And they destroy all of their transport. So now they are stuck on Goodenough Island, and they're actually stuck on the island for almost 2 months because it takes that long for the Japanese to be able to bring in more ships at night to actually get them off that island. So they're completely out of the battle just to start with. Then the main force lands 2 miles short of their objective. Well, 2 miles doesn't seem very far, but 2 miles walking through a mangrove swamp aren't exactly a good place to be. So this also throws their plan way off. So they've got a lot of things going against them. But unfortunately for the Australians, they put a militia unit out in front of their main line of resistance, their MLR, and that Australian militia unit is routed by these Japanese Special Naval Landing Force. And again, they're just trying to march up the coast here to get to those air bases. Then on the 26th, the next day, the P-40s again go and destroy most of the Japanese supplies, and control of the daytime because of their air power is totally in Australian hands. So Japanese ships can only come in at night when the RAAF isn't flying and basically supply or do anything. So now the Japanese have lost most of their food and ammunition. Well, the 2 tanks actually are doing a pretty good job because the Australians don't have any tanks and they don't have really good anti-tank guns. But as you can see here, the terrain is just such a swampy mess that the 2 tanks actually aren't destroyed. They actually get stuck in the mud and they're abandoned by the Japanese. And then the Special Naval Landing Force, the Japanese force, is starting to take more and more and more casualties, and they realize that Milne Bay is not lightly defended at all. It's heavily defended, and they make the decision that they're going to have to pull out. And so finally on September 5th, the Japanese withdraw from Milne Bay. Well, what's the deal with this? This is actually the first time that an Allied force has defeated a Japanese force in World War II. It sends Australian morale up quite a bit higher, and actually has an effect throughout the British Empire, because again, this is the first time a Japanese force has ever been defeated. And consequently, even the British troops in Burma are excited and happy about this, and it raises morale throughout the entire European aspect of the Battle of the Pacific. All right, now we're going to talk about the Kokoda Trail. I talked about that in the first couple of slides. The plan is going to be to come from, the Japanese are going to land at Bunagona, this area here. They're going to march across the Kokoda Trail or track and attack Port Moresby via land. So what they're going to do is they're going to make this now, instead of a sea campaign, a land campaign. The Japanese actually think there's a road. As you may remember, I told you there's not even a road now. But the Japanese think there might be a road there, and they bring in a big amount of native porters and construction people, engineering people, to help build an airfield and to improve the road so they can launch their assault. Bunagona itself, the part up north, is only defended by 4 platoons of Australian and Papuan militia. Again, these are not particularly good troops, and 4 platoons isn't very much. MacArthur is planning to reinforce this because he wants to use this area for a base, but unlike Milne Bay, this time the Japanese have beat him to the punch. So they're moving, the Australians are moving forces along the trail to get here because they're afraid of Japanese air power in that area, because Lae and Salamau are close, and Rabaul isn't far either. So they decide not to use shipping, but they're going to march overland. The Japanese, again, beat them to the punch, and they land near Buna on the July 21st, and that's before the Australian 39th Brigade can arrive. The Japanese move really quickly, and in just a couple of days, they've made it all the way to this town right here. And what happens then is there's a meeting engagement between the Australian force and what's called the South Sea Force. That's the Japanese name for this group. They call this the South Sea Force under General Hori. And the South Sea Force, using their infiltration tactics, again and again, these are British militia, or excuse me, Australian militia. They're not the best. And they get nearly surrounded by the Japanese, and actually their commanding officer is killed. And they are forced to retreat from Kokoda. Well, the Japanese now have Kokoda, and Kokoda has a little airfield. But the Japanese never take advantage of this fact. They never use the airfield at Kokoda as an opportunity for resupply. This is a major mistake. So now any supplies that are coming in for the Japanese are still going by native porter, carried on the backs of their men and on the backs of these natives, up and down this trail, over the mountains. So it's very, very difficult to keep supply going. So a South Sea Force halts at Kokoda, and they begin to bring in more and more troops. And by August 29th, he actually has now, Hori has a force of 6,000 men. That's pretty good sized for this terrain. The Australians have just deployed 2 brigades from the 7th AIF, so they're putting in better quality troops. But they've also got the 39th Brigade, which has been badly hurt, and another brigade of militia troops called the 30th that are still in this area. The Japanese have resumed their advance on the 14th, and they capture, I guess it would be Surava, and the fighting continues, and they continue to push the militia troops further and further back. And by until August 5th and September 30th, they managed to get all the way to this place called Templeton's Crossing. So again, you can see the Japanese are slowly moving closer and closer to Port Moresby. Well, then the 7th AIF starts to get involved. And the the Australians are very confident that this crack unit, this professional force, will be the answer to their problem. It doesn't quite work out that way. They get themselves on a place called Mission Ridge. They think this is a good defensible position, and they have 1,400 men, which is a reasonable amount. And the South Sea Force has 1,570 men, so not a huge numeric advantage. But they use the tactics that they used very effectively in Malaya and basically throughout the early part of the war. They're going to fix with a frontal attack the British, well, I got a problem with that one, the Australians, and then they're going to have guys go along this river and advance through the jungle to catch the Australian force in the rear. And this area here is actually relatively flat. It's not very mountainous. Now again, this is the trail. So you want to make sure that you capture that trail because that's the only easy way to transport anything. Well, they do manage to slip through and get in behind them. And they also have managed to bring up 6 of those little cannons. Now, the British don't have any artillery support because it's just too difficult to bring it up. So they got a couple of advantages. They got a slight numeric advantage, and they've got a better idea. The Australian forces are actually poorly deployed for the defense they should have managed. They also have a guide. One of the Papuan natives decides that he's going to side with the Japanese, and he leads the Japanese through the jungle back onto the trail behind the Australian forces. So now those 3 battalions of the AIF, crack troops, they're cut off. And so the SSF now holds the trail. There's miscommunication, and one of the battalions of the Australian force retreats without orders. There's a confusion there. And so now the Australians have no choice but to get off the trail and try to escape through the jungle. And one of the units, the 227, does not get back to the Australian lines for 3 weeks. Thing is, the South Sea Force is actually unaware that they've had this big of a victory. They don't realize that the gate is basically open for them to take Port Moresby. There's nothing really in front of them. But they don't understand that, and again, they can't really, it's hard, aerial reconnaissance or whatever doesn't really work real well in the jungle, so they're unaware and they don't move quickly. So the Australians are able to bring up more troops because Port Moresby is getting closer and closer, and they move to a place called Amita Ridge. Well, they brought up more troops, and Brigadier General Potts, he gets the axe for poor performance. So he's sacked. The SSF has routed a combat veteran Australian Army unit. It's a huge blow to the AIF, but they are learning the fact that they're not fighting in the Western Desert anymore. They're fighting in the jungle. And they learn from this experience, and they actually managed to hold the Japanese at Amita Ridge. And interestingly, this is the last time in World War II that an Australian and a an Australian or a U.S. force is defeated by the Japanese. The Japanese never again in the war beat a U.S. or an Australian force in an attack. So they never have another successful attack. And this is September of 1942. So you can see that the Australians at this point have learned a significant lesson about this. But the Japanese, again, I think it's amazing that they never again have an offensive that's effective or successful at this time of the war. So Amita Ridge is 20 miles from Port Moresby, and it's much, much easier now for the Australians to bring up supplies from 20 miles than it is for the Japanese to move supplies all the way down the trail to get there. The other thing that's going on at this time that's really, really important is that we have invaded Guadalcanal. So the Japanese are now, where do they put their forces? Are they going to stop the U.S. Marines at Guadalcanal? Are they going to continue to attack Port Moresby? What are they going to do? Well, they make the decision that Guadalcanal is more important, and they tell the South Sea Force to stop attacking, and eventually they tell them, I believe on the September 26th, to withdraw. Well, they withdraw all the way back to Bunagona. And to your point earlier, I told you things are going to get worse. Think about what it's like to fight in that. You're literally fighting in a mangrove swamp. So this is, to me, it's beyond hideous to imagine it. Oh, no. This is much worse than Vietnam. Vietnam is significantly north of here. It's not nearly as hot or malarial. It's triple canopy rainforest. Yeah, there's jungle in Vietnam, don't get me wrong. There's swamps in Vietnam. But this whole place is a mess. It's really bad. And remember, in Vietnam, we have a lot better supplies. These guys are living on a shoestring, what you're going to see. So MacArthur was under the impression that it will be no problem to take Bunagona because, the Japanese aren't going to be that big a deal. They're cut off from resupply. His chief of staff, Sutherland, says the only thing they've got there are hasty field entrenchments. Well, remember I told you the Japanese brought in all those engineers? Well, those engineers couldn't build a road, but they could build fortifications. And they have fortified the entire swamp. The Allied plan is to have the Australian 7th Division move down the trail, or move north actually on the trail, and then the U.S. is going to land the 32nd Division near Buna. Now the 32nd Division, oh, here's another good picture of war here. You can see these guys are basically living in a mud hole. They put some tree branches there, or little tree trunks there, so they can sit above the water in their trench. And it's just, this is a bad spot. Okay, so anyway, the 32nd Division is a National Guard unit. They're not particularly well trained. They're certainly not combat veterans. And certainly they're not prepared in any way, shape, or form to fight in these conditions. They're expecting to use artillery and trucks and tanks in a European battle. Well, they're kind of thrown into this hellhole in New Guinea, really. They're sent to Buna, not in like landing ship tanks or anything we would think about when we would look about an invasion or for a U.S. force to land. They're literally sent there in old fishing boats and trawlers and coastal craft because this place is full of reefs, and LSTs and light draft landing ships at this time just aren't available. So MacArthur throws these guys in without any tanks, without any artillery. Their medical supplies, unfortunately, are sunk by a Japanese aircraft, so they have no quinine or atabrine to prevent malaria or to suppress malaria. And they don't have a lot of food. They don't have a lot of ammunition. They don't have a lot of anything because they're not supplied properly. They launch a bunch of attacks starting on November 19th, and needless to say, these attacks are not particularly successful. Again, you got raw troops without artillery and without tanks. Oh, by the way, they're fighting in the swamp. So, now the Japanese positions that those engineers have built, there's little places of high ground. Well, guess where we're going to build our fortifications? We're going to build our fortifications on that little high ground, and we're going to use coconut logs. And coconut logs are surprisingly resistant to shell fire, because they're very fibrous. And then we're going to cover this with dirt. And then we're going to have plants grow on it, because we've had some time for this to go on. So these things are almost invisible. So now you're armed with basically rifles, machine guns, and mortars. You have no heavy artilleries or heavy weapons. And you're trying to take these Japanese positions. Well, you can't outflank them. You can't go behind them because they're in the middle of this wetland. So in order to go behind them, you have to literally wade through waist-deep mud to get in there. So basically, you're forced to do frontal attacks against fixed positions. This is not a good plan. Well, MacArthur gets angry about this. And he sends in General Eichelberger, who's actually the Corps commander. And Eichelberger gets in there, and there are some issues because this is a National Guard unit. These aren't necessarily your best and brightest professional leaders. And he fires the commanding general, he fires all the regimental commanders, and he fires all the battalion commanders. So basically he's taken out the entire leadership staff of this division. They're gone. They're all shipped back to the United States. And he also demands better logistics support. Well, how are they going to do that? Because you got coastal freighters, and they're not bringing in enough stuff. So they begin to use airdrops. But the way they do their airdrops is they don't have parachutes. There's really never been any thought process about how to do this. So they start wrapping munitions and things into blankets. So, got a major problem with the way that's going down. So by early December, the battle has reached a stalemate. Allied logistics are slowly getting better, but the Japanese situation is rapidly deteriorating because we have air power from Port Moresby that is interdicting the ability for the Japanese to resupply their troops. They do get some destroyers in at night, and they evacuate 1,200 men. The Australians managed to bring in some artillery and 13 tanks, and this really becomes the most effective thing that could have been done. So with the tanks and with the artillery, now they can go after these little Japanese blockhouses much more effectively, because the Japanese don't really have any anti-tank guns. So the Japanese know they're in trouble, and 1,000 to 1,900 of them decide to escape into the jungle and try to make their way back to Lake Salamaua. Some of them do make it back. Many of them, like I said, end up as the blue plate special for the local inhabitants. But the Japanese that remain are starving to death and are very sick. So they have perhaps evidence that the Japanese began to eat their own dead. By January 22nd of 1943, the battle is over, but the cost has been very high. The Australians have 2,004 killed in action and 2,267 wounded. There's no count for the amount of sick they had. Nobody knows. That number wasn't properly kept. U.S. casualties for the 32nd Division are 887 killed, 2,172 wounded, and 7,920 sick, for total casualties of that division of 10,879. That's huge casualties for a division. And Japanese losses are estimated at 4,000 killed in battle and 3,000 die from starvation and disease. Well, let's wrap it up with the Australian Army in World War II. I don't think a lot of Americans know about the major contribution that the Australians actually made in the war. I think that we don't tend to think about this a whole lot, but they were extremely important. The 9th Division finally comes back from Africa and becomes a Corps-sized 3-division force, and is actually MacArthur's main infantry units for the battles in New Guinea in 1942 and 1943. They go on to be very effective at numerous places. As you can see, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but those are all battles that they fought. So the Australians really do make a huge contribution to MacArthur's side of the war, which is the Southern Pacific area. And the Australians actually launched the last Allied invasion of World War II when they attacked Borneo in 1945. So with that, we're going to finish up today. So thank you for coming. I guess I might be able to take a brief question or two if anybody has one.
The New Zealand forces were part of the Australian?
No, they function separately.
Well, they have joint memorials.
Yes, they do, but they still were considered separate troops. They were not part of the AIF. Yes?
How did those tanks get over there to fight this war?
Barges.
Okay.
They brought them in on barges, little coastal barges. They managed to get the tank onto it and then managed to get them off. I don't know how they got them off. Probably had to build a little bridge. But that's what they did. They literally brought them in, and same with the artillery. Some of the artillery was brought in. The question was, how did the tanks get to Bunagona? Just so you know. And the tanks got in on little barges. Some of the artillery, they did have a little airstrip eventually that they built, and the artillery was disassembled and put on planes, mostly DC-3s, and was then reassembled in the field. Anything else? All right, thank you all for coming. I know it was a little short, so.